those who don't know me, my name is Michelle Thomas. I'm Principal Regulatory Counsel for T-Mobile. I work on the state regulatory side. I have the pleasure of being one of the 4 co-chairs for the New York chapter of the FCBA. Along with me today is Jennifer Costier, who is also one of the co-chairs. And Susanna Zwerling and Lavonda Reed-Huff are also currently and will continue to be this chapter's co-chairs for next year. This, in fact, today, our incentive auction proceeding program, which will be a panel discussion moderated by Jonathan Cohen from Wilkinson, Barker, and Knauer, will be our last program for the session. We typically go quiet for the summer so people can enjoy their vacations. And we intend to be picking back up in the fall timeframe, currently working on various programs, but the one of note that we will be working on over the summer is a over-the-air TV Anywhere program, which a lot of exciting stuff going on in New York. So we'll be planning on doing that most likely in the New York City area in the early fall. So I have the pleasure to make the introductions of our moderator for the evening, and then he'll dispense with the important details of working the moderated panel. But Jonathan Cohen from Wilkinson, Barker, and Knauer is a partner. He's going to briefly give an overview of where we are with the incentive auction proceeding, kind of give you a background, and then we'll hear from the individual panelists. So with that, Jonathan.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the New York chapter for hosting this panel. So thank you all for being here. As is obvious, our topic is the upcoming FCC incentive auction of broadcast spectrum. And we've got a tremendous panel whose bios you have. What I was planning to do is just spend a couple minutes setting the table with some of the background, the history, of how we got to this point. And then Charles will give us kind of a consumer perspective, David, the broadcaster perspective, Armand, kind of the, for want of a better term, Wall Street or financial analyst perspective on the auction, and Chris from T-Mobile, the wireless carrier perspective. They're obviously some of the most interested parties with the spectrum ultimately bound for their use. So we'll just talk a little bit of the background, some of the basics, and the key issues, and some of the process and timing elements. So how many people ride the subway on a regular basis? Okay, most of us. Okay, so I had an interesting experience on the subway the other day. I'm not always on the subway, but I used to commute every day, and it used to be that you were on the subway and everybody would have their newspaper, consuming information. The other day, I saw no newspapers, but almost everybody was glued to their portable mobile device. So they were consuming information, but they were using spectrum to do it, not ink and paper. So that's really what this is all about, the demand for data delivered to mobile devices over the air. So Cisco has put out studies every year. They put out a global networking index, and they found in their most recent report that global mobile data traffic increased by 70% in the year 2012 and is expected to increase 13-fold by the year 2017. And one other interesting statistic is that by the end of this year, the number of mobile connected devices will exceed the number of people on Earth. So that's kind of mind-blowing. The idea of incentive auctions has been kicking around for a while. It kind of got a little bit of a kickstart in 2009 in the economic stimulus legislation, which, among other things, directed the FCC to develop the National Broadband Plan, which they came out with in 2010. And along with a presidential directive that President Obama issued in June of 2010, set the policy goal of freeing up 500 megahertz of spectrum from other uses for commercial mobile use within 10 years, 300 megahertz within 5 years. They haven't, it's now, 3 years later, we haven't gotten there yet. We're not even close to getting there yet, but 120 megahertz, at least in the National Broadband Plan, was to come from the broadcast UHF spectrum. In 2012, after a whole lot of lobbying by the administration and the wireless industry, which really needs the spectrum to provide services, Title VI of the Middle Class Tax Relief Act was passed, authorizing the FCC to conduct this incentive auction and requiring that it be conducted on a one-time only basis sometime within 10 years. The FCC started a proceeding on it last fall. Comments have been filed. There's always a lot of churn in ex partes, and we're in the middle of that process right now. So what is an incentive auction? In prior FCC spectrum auctions, which they've been doing now for almost 20 years, the FCC would identify spectrum, carve it up into licenses, and auction it off to the highest bidder. And if there were incumbents on those frequencies, usually there would be a process set up to relocate them with the new licensees sharing the costs for the relocation. The incentive auction approaches this in a different way, allowing the incumbent users to actually participate in the auction process on a volunteer basis to relinquish their spectrum usage rights in exchange for payment. This is an enormously complicated process. More than one commissioner has referred to it as 3D chess on steroids. So there's a lot of moving parts. It's a very difficult problem for them to solve. And but the FCC has poured a lot of resources into it, and the industries also are paying close attention and lobbying heavily. So for the wireless carriers, it's important how much spectrum will be cleared. Will it be on a nationwide basis, or will there be different amounts of spectrum cleared in different markets? One of the key components as to how much spectrum can be cleared is how many broadcasters will step up to volunteer to relinquish their spectrum usage rights. A little deeper into the weeds are issues like, should they be paired or unpaired spectrum blocks? What technologies will benefit from different choices on the band plan? How much of the spectrum should be permitted to be used for unlicensed uses as opposed to licensed uses? There's a companion proceeding at the FCC on mobile spectrum holdings to determine whether there should be limits placed on the amount of spectrum that any one entity can have an interest in, and that could have an effect on the auction process. And auction methodology, there are a number of auction game theorists in the academic community, some of whom have been hired by the FCC. Some of the most brilliant minds in this field are actually working for the FCC to try and develop new and innovative auction models that, at least in theory, would produce the most efficient economic result. Reasonable minds differ on that, though. On the broadcaster side, obviously the key issues have to do with the impact on broadcasters who choose not to relinquish spectrum. If some of the UHF broadcast band is reallocated, then the users in that spectrum will have to be repacked. And we did a repacking just a few years ago with the DTV transition. It was not an easy process, I think is fair to say. But that's going to be done again in this. So the broadcasters who really have no interest in relinquishing spectrum really have no reason to see this as anything but a no-win proposition. So they're playing a defensive game at this point. For the broadcasters who are looking at the possibility of relinquishing spectrum in some way, shape, or form, either going off the air entirely or not, how much is it worth? How should they value it? And Armand will address some of those issues. And the auction methodology, of course, is important there too. As I mentioned, there's scores of people at the FCC working on this. This 45 number is a few months old. There may be more people now who have been brought in as things have started to heat up. Acting Chairwoman Clyburn has articulated that she intends to stick with the Commission's, with Chairman Janikowski's previously announced timetable of getting auction rules issued through a report and order by the end of this year, with the incentive auction taking place in 2014. In my travels, I've encountered a fair amount of skepticism that that timetable can actually be met. And on a recent appearance on C-SPAN, Chairman Janikowski even kind of left a little room for slippage in that date. But as I said, the auction has to happen by statute by 2022. That leaves a lot of room, obviously. If it drags on for years before they have the auction, there'll probably be a lot of different dynamics in play, and a lot of the things that we talk about today may become moot. So that's sort of the overview. And Michelle, if you can put up Charles's slides, then we'll hand it over to him. Thanks.
So I'm Chuck Bell. I work at Consumers Union. We're the nonprofit organization that publishes consumer reports. And yeah, there we go. And so we're a nonprofit organization that advocates for affordable, accessible telecommunications. And I wanted to point out that we're part of a larger community of groups that are concerned with having a free and open internet, with having widespread broadband deployments in rural, urban, and suburban areas, having some diversity of ownership and contents and control in the media system. And so there's quite a number of other organizations in our space that we cooperate. I would say our expertise, we have a much smaller lobby than the telecom industry or the media industry, but we have quite a number of groups participating, like Free Press, Consumer Federation of America, New America Foundation, Public Knowledge, Benton Foundation, Media Access Project. And so organizations like that, we band together in this sort of ad hoc public interest spectrum coalition. And if you Google for that term, you can find a lot more expertise than I personally have of people who've written all kinds of papers about these topics. So I think we accept the proposition that was behind the law that authorizes the incentive auction, that wireless use is growing by leaps and bounds, and there is intense interest and demand to get more spectrum. So, and we also think that using the proceeds of the spectrum to fund a public safety broadband network, FirstNets, is really an important issue. We think of telephones and wireless devices as public safety devices, and in that light, it's interesting to note that over 34 million people at the end of 2012 use a wireless phone as their exclusive telephone device. And that has a lot of implications, because it means that if you need to report a fire or a medical emergency in your house, your wireless device is really important to you. And recently, when we had the disruptions caused by Hurricane Sandy, we had this hearing over in New Jersey that the FCC called about network resilience. And this is an issue that's really important to the consumer and public interest community, as it is to the wireless industry. And we think it's really important we have standards for things like that, and also lifeline rates for phones for people who may not be able to afford service. So, so that's just one of the many kind of more practical issues that we deal with as a consumer organization. What I really wanted to flag in my remarks, because I know there's a lot of ways you can come at this issue, I wanted to just kind of step back at this kind of 50,000 foot level and look at the context where we have a highly concentrated ownership of telecom and media companies, generally speaking, here in the United States. And we have, this may be a little bit complicated, but I wanted to try to get across the idea that people are really fighting for the attention of the consumer on the various screens that we use. So the screen of your mobile phone, the screen of your computer, the screen of your tablet, and the screen of your television set. And if you think of the companies that are involved in each of these spaces, they're really media giants in most of these spaces. You know, we know for mobile phones that the ownership is highly concentrated in that space. In broadband, we've been facing some really significant problems with sort of a cartel and lack of effective competition. You see the same thing in the broadcasting cable space that controls the ability of people to get their contents distributed. If you're a small nonprofit publisher like us, you might worry about the four digital horsemen of the apocalypse: Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon, which might be the companies that you're going to have to negotiate with if you want to get your content seen by anybody. So they're very much a part of the mix. And then on the tablets, you have the iPad is a great example of a tethered device where the operator, Apple, has an awful lot of control over what types of contents and applications are going to appear there. So I think it's important to consider this context, and particularly this side of things, because we have a lot of concentration of broadband and mobile wireless service, and two of the same companies really involved with large positions in the space, Verizon and AT&T. So when it comes to broadband, and this is important for smartphones and the broadband that you use in your home, 20% of Americans have access to only one single broadband provider. And then another big chunk of Americans only has access to a duopoly. And we argue that there's really not effective competition between duopolies. And if we look at markets around the country, prices remain exceedingly high. Consumers don't have choices of like a la carte cable or just selecting the channels that they want. And lots of other constraints on the use of the internet that they might not otherwise face. So we see from that situation a lack of an incentive to expand markets, to build out to underserved rural and urban areas, and to lower prices for consumers. And we've seen an increasing number of sort of private deals that are beyond the reach of public policy that go against the consumer. So when we look in the wireless space, we've got four companies, Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and T-Mobile, that control about 90% of the wireless market. So we could regard that as a very high level of concentration, and just two of them have more than 60% of the market. So we would argue that this interferes with the normal operations of a market economy. Americans pay an average of about $635 a year for mobile service, and this is far more than other countries in Europe, where consumers might pay $150 to $200 a year for mobile service, including smartphone service. So we would argue that consumers are being hurt by excessive market concentration in wireless. And so the relevance of that, one other aspect here is that some of the advocates in our area, in the consumer and community area, would hope that the wireless sector could provide an affordable third pipe for broadband, that it could be help to expand competition, expand choices, but we see many efforts by industry actors to foreclose that, for example, by pushing legislation to ban community ownership or to prevent community operation of broadband and wireless networks. So when it comes to the spectrum auction, we can also see that if we just leave it to the normal way things have been working, an awful lot of the spectrum ends up in the hands of those four companies. And it's a fear that many people have from this auction in particular, that much more spectrum would go to the top two companies, Verizon and AT&T. And this is from a study that was done by Mark Cooper from Consumer Federation of America. So we argue that consumers need competition and choice when it comes to wireless service. And in that light, in the law that authorizes the incentive auction, it's made clear that the FCC can still make rules of general applicability, including rules concerning spectrum aggregation that can promote competition. The FCC could, for example, impose a limit on how much spectrum any one company could have, a spectrum cap. And they can also set rules for specific auctions to prevent any one company from winning too much spectrum in that auction. So we think that this capacity that the FCC has is critical and really must and has to be used to advance consumer interests and competition and choice in wireless. And one other sort of supporting point or contextual point is we think there's a very strong case for expanding the shared use of unlicensed spectrum that might be shared by many users. We think that shared use of public airwaves can lower consumer costs and increase consumer value. It also encourages experimenting experimentation and innovation, such as development of new Wi-Fi technologies or new things using radio spectrum. And one example of this would be greater ability to carry traffic offloaded from the mobile networks. If we think of people using tablets in coffee shops and so forth, it's actually had been estimated as much as $25 billion a year in data traffic goes over those types of usages using shared use of spectrum through a common Wi-Fi network. And so that reduces some of the burden on the cell towers and backhaul and so forth. And it's also a good thing for consumers who are able to get the information that they need working in those contexts. So we think through the use of unlicensed spectrum, we could have increased coverage of Wi-Fi and similar technologies, and also expanded rural broadband deployments. That would be very much a benefit to consumers. So the point is that in auctions, there is a lot of commercial pressure to sell off the available spectrum that we have to commercial parties. But we would argue that we need a mix of strategies that balance the public interest in the use of that spectrum. And after all, it is the public's airwaves, so we should decide in a democracy how we want them to be used. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. I should have said earlier that I'm hoping that we will have a discussion, and if any of the speakers say something that you want to comment on or have a question about or are in any way unclear, I'm sure that won't happen. Please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll all be happy to engage in back and forth.
Is it Armand next?
No, David's next.
That's why David's looking at me like that.
You might talk in.
Yeah, I have no
I can
idea.
hear
That stuff's over my head.
That might be fun, though, if you present.
That's what we like to do at the New York chapter of the FCBA.
Creative.
Thank you. My name is David Donovan. I'm president of the New York State Broadcasters Association, and I've been dealing with spectrum issues for quite some time and was actually involved very heavily in the last digital transition. Just a couple of things to begin with. Over the air, the concerns that broadcasters have largely deal with over-the-air transmission. Now, you can receive local television through a number of venues. You can receive it through satellite, you can receive it through cable, you can receive it through Fios. You can get it through a variety of sort of paid-based services. What we're focusing on and the concerns that we have here are the ability to continue to transmit signals to the American public free over the air. In effect, for the consumer simply to be able to go out and get an antenna and receive that signal. Why is that important? It's important for a number of things. First of all, it acts as an effective counterweight to pay-based services. And in fact, in recent years, you have seen something what is called cord cutting in the business, in which folks are in fact reverting back to over-the-air television with an antenna, also purchasing Netflix and creating a package. So it is a consumer's option. That's important. The second piece of this is during emergencies. I do have some flyers that I put up front in terms of during Hurricane Sandy in New York City, for example, when most of the public communication systems went out for a variety of reasons, whether they're connected to the power grid or whether they were overloaded or they got flooded, over-the-air television remained on the air, as did radio. So it was able to continue providing service to New Yorkers. It also coupled and partnered with radio stations where NBC News, for example, in town, was being broadcast over WOR radio. WABC TV's news during Superstorm Sandy was being broadcast, the audio portion, by WEPN AM and FM. And the combined efforts, your ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, PIX, they're looking at about 122 hours of storm coverage for free without commercial interruption. So the aspect of providing local public service, I think, is exceedingly important. And while all of us have cable and all of us have satellite, it's important to remember, just to give you some numbers, in New York City alone, there's about 640,000 people who get their television over the air with an antenna. Most of those populations are the most vulnerable populations in New York City. Across New York State, the number is about 1.25 million people. In Rochester, for example, I believe it's 11% of the total population. And those numbers tend to be growing. So the use of the spectrum is exceedingly important for continued service, but also for development of new services, and I'll get that in the end, particularly with respect to mobile DTV. But what are our major concerns here? We really have three key issues here that cut across the whole proceeding. First, we want a successful voluntary auction, provided that it is indeed voluntary, but it's important that it is successful. And I'll go into a number of reasons why I think issues we need to look at to ensure that it is successful. The second point is most of my members and most broadcasters intend to stay in broadcasting after the incentive auction. In other words, not necessarily participate in the auction. They should be able to be held harmless. In other words, all the viewers that can receive their signal right now over the air with an antenna should be able to do so after this is all over. We learned in the DTV transition that when you start reducing coverage areas or moving people around, consumers get mad. They call us, they call the FCC, it just becomes a mess. So you have to be exceedingly careful here. And for a number of reasons, this repacking and shifting around is going to be far more complex now than it was in 2009 when we did the digital transition. The final thing is, and I just want to touch on this because it is rather esoteric, we need a workable band plan so that once spectrum is reallocated and auctioned off in the incentive auction to the wireless companies, we need a band plan that is efficient, but one that will not result in additional interference to consumers who are trying to watch television over the air. So those are the three key things. We support a voluntary auction. We want it to be successful. We need repacking that holds consumers harmless so that they can still get free over-the-air television. And we want a band plan that doesn't result in a whole lot of interference. Let's drill down a little bit on this. First, it has to be voluntary. And Congress has said it must be voluntary. We assume it will continue to be voluntary. But what does voluntary mean? What voluntary means is that we are going to have an incentive auction, and those broadcasters who want to participate will. And those broadcasters who don't have to, and will be held harmless. There are a number of ways you can manipulate federal regulations to create, quote, incentives to participate in the auction. And we have to be very careful that we don't tread down that path. So we truly want it to be voluntary. We broadcasters would get compensated in this auction. If they turned in their 6 megahertz worth of spectrum, they would get compensated for it. If they decided to cut deals and share channels with other stations in the market, thereby freeing up some channels. Also, if they moved from UHF, which is the prime spectrum that the wireless industry would like, down to the VHF band. Now, the reason why you may get compensated for that is in the VHF band, the transmission capabilities actually are better in UHF than VHF. We all grew up with, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9 being the primo channels. Not necessarily in digital. In digital, the UHF channels actually are superior. So there should be some compensation here. Now, I think, whoop, I hit the wrong button here, excuse me. The other aspect to this, and I know other panelists are going to touch on this, and I'll touch very lightly on this, is evaluation issues. You want broadcasters to participate in the auction. So the question is, if I turn in my 6 megahertz, what is it worth in the auction? What would you get paid? And the answer sitting here today is, we don't know. Now, there are two generic ways to look at this. One, I will pay you consistent with what your broadcast business is worth. That's one way to take a look at it. The other way to take a look at it is, no, you're going to get paid for the value of your spectrum to the potential ultimate user. Think of it as selling land. When your shopping center or a new use comes in and you sell your house and your plot of land, is the value that you get the value of it as a residential structure, or is it the value of the potential entity that's going to ultimately use your land, even though it will be for something else? Those are two very different valuations. And the question is right now in Washington is how is the FCC going to adopt rules, or will they adopt rules regarding valuations? And that's an extremely important issue. There is also a collateral issue that Jonathan raised, and that is the FCC is potentially limiting who can participate in the auction, who the potential purchasers can be. Those are issues regarding whether or not we have a duopoly with respect, or alleged duopoly with respect to ownership and spectrum. We really don't take a position on that, but it is something that you have to look at because it clearly will affect the price and may very well affect the participation rates in the auction. Now, what is our real concern here for those who want to remain broadcasting and serving their communities? It's in the statute. And the statute says, in doing all this, the FCC shall make all reasonable efforts to preserve, as of the date of this act, the coverage areas and population served of each broadcast television licensee. In effect, when you look at this, it says, hold them harmless. Don't leave consumers disenfranchised. You should be able to serve the same people that you're serving now. Unfortunately, when you begin to look at this, there are those who don't believe that says what we think it says, because they only have to use all reasonable efforts. What does that mean? In addition, the statute details the definition of a coverage area. That's what that OET 69 reference refers to. However, the FCC has started a collateral proceeding redefining what OET 69, what the engineering definitions are. The net effect of that will be to actually potentially reduce coverage areas. So we're very concerned about this. This is the guidepost that the broadcasters are looking at. That's the North Star for us. And that's what we're trying to make sure the FCC is faithful to the statutory provisions. How complex is this going to be? At a very high level. If you took 120 megahertz, which is what the FCC's National Broadband Plan said, out of channels 31 to 51, nationwide I'm affecting 672 full power stations directly, 209 Class A stations, and over 3,000 low power TV stations. And I have to take those from channel 31 to 51 and put them into the UHF channels between 14 and 30. That is a real difficult task. In New York, for example, 3 channels are devoted to land mobile public safety, 3 television channels already. So bring out your spectrum shoehorn, because it's going to be difficult to put these in. Now, the other piece to this, and the effect of this is not necessarily limited to those folks in channels 31 to 51. It's everybody. It's potentially all television channels. And the reason is, to pull out your engineering shoehorn and make this work, you may have to reshuffle the entire deck, which means every channel may be reassigned a new channel number, just like we all went through in the DTV transition. Only this time, you won't have this analog station that stays on the air while you do it. You're going to have to actually shut down and move channels around. In New York City, it gets really complex because everybody's on Empire, and they may all try to move to World Trade, which brings out a whole host of issues. I know you can't see this, but it fit, and let me explain what this is. If I take 120 megahertz out of, or 20 television channels out of the television band in New York, what does that do? In Rochester, it will affect 7 out of 7 television stations in Rochester will be affected and may have a diminution of service if no one participated in the auction, but the FCC still tried to take 120 megahertz of spectrum. In the city, 13 out of 27 off-air television stations in New York City will be affected. Stated in an alternative way, to avoid a reduction in coverage of the remaining stations, you may have to get 13 out of 27 stations in New York City to participate in the auction. That's a pretty high number. Rochester and Buffalo, and I'll get into this a little bit later, it's really tight up there because of our friends north of the border.
What do you mean under the New York indirectly affected by Canadian treaty?
Indirectly means this. When you do channel allotments for television or for any spectrum, you pick a point. And at this longitude and latitude, I'm going to put this channel. Now, in order to put in a channel on the same channel, I have to go hundreds of kilometers away. Otherwise, the two will interfere in sort of a classic Venn diagram overlap. The reason why New York City is implicated is this. Any television channel that's within 250 miles of the border, or 400 kilometers, I think, has to go through Canadian approval. It's part of the treaty. If I run out of stations in Rochester or Buffalo is going to have to steal stations from Rochester, allotments from Rochester. Rochester is going to have to steal allotments from Syracuse. Syracuse is going to steal from Albany, and you betcha Albany is going to try to steal from New York City. The same thing is going on in Pennsylvania, and together we'll try to steal from New Jersey. That's what happened back in the 50s. Politically, that isn't going to work, but the bottom line is when you're doing channel allotments, the space differentials that you need to do that allotment are fairly substantial. So that's sort of what this means. The net effect of this is, and these are real numbers using the real allotment engineering basics that we used when we did the DTV channels in the first place. So I've talked about this, why we're concerned. Obviously, we're concerned about all the off-air viewers in New York City, all 640,000 of them, and they're being the most vulnerable populations. We're concerned about the OET 69 proceeding that the FCC has because it may redefine how you define interference. And the way the FCC has a service area is, this is the area that you can serve. Picture it as a circle. You can receive that, but if I put a station over here, I will start causing interference around the edges. It's the interference-free zone that allows consumers to watch television without getting snow or fuzz, or in the case of digital, just blank screens. That proceeding is exceedingly important to us. Translators. Translators are a concern that most people think they're Intermountain West concerns. They're not. In upstate New York, if you're Mountain Lakes Public Television, the way you get your signal throughout the Adirondacks is by a translator. In New York City on Long Island, the way a big chunk of Queens and a little bit further out gets their signal is through what we call a fill-in translator, because that area happens to get interference from Hartford. So we needed to put a separate translator on Long Island. Under the FCC's rules, all translators are not, repeat, not protected.
Isn't it actually the statute's rule?
Oh, it's a statute, right. The statute does not protect these or give them a priority. That does not mean legally you can't protect them. But in terms of what is guaranteed protection, this is what could happen. And as a result, we may lose a lot of service in New York State. It's not just a problem in Montana. Now, Canadian border issues are significant. One, if you look at the arrangement that we currently have with Canada, there are literally hundreds of megahertz of spectrum on the other side of the border that are not being used by our Canadian brothers. Now, the issue is, what's in it for them and why should they give it to us? New York State broadcasters, along with the wireless industry, but the New York State broadcasters in particular, have been asking to kick this issue up to a very high level. We've always had coordinations issues across the border with the FCC and Industry Canada and the Canadians. But this isn't just an industry interference issue. This is big. There is spectrum on the other side of the border that will solve the Rochester-Buffalo issue, that if we could get it. So Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand have asked that Secretary of State Kerry get involved and actually kick these debates and these discussions up to a very high level. And everyone in the New York delegation has supported it. In New York City, there's another issue that's unique to the city, and that's wireless microphones. Right now, because of a lot of the white space decisions, there are 2 television channels that are devoted to wireless microphones in New York City. This proposal proposes to squeeze out those 2 channels and have a lot of sharing. Our concern is that we use wireless microphones on our on-the-spot news reporting. It's not venue specific. I have no idea where the next, God forbid, terrorist attack is going to be, or where the Hurricane Sandy, where the floods are going to breach. You need to be able to go out there and be sure that your wireless microphones work. This is one of the hidden issues in this proceeding that not a whole lot of people have focused on. In New York City, it's important because it affects news gathering, and a lot of wireless microphones are used by Broadway. That's a whole other set of issues. As I said, this impacts all stations. The other thing to keep in mind is relocation costs. Congress set aside $1.75 billion. I don't think that that's going to be enough. And the question is whether that should be the FCC's budget for relocation costs, or whether or not it will be more expensive. I can tell you in New York City, the relocation costs are going to be far and above beyond what they are in any other part of the country, particularly if you try to work on Empire. You can only work a short period of time, and there are a ton of limits on that. So, band plan issues, and then I'll sit down. We support what's called the Down from 51 plan. Our concern with the proposals, some of the proposals that have come out, is that we do not want the variable plan, which the FCC is proposing, is that you want to have essentially a nationwide block for wireless. It's easier for them. They can make equipment. They can sell it. One of the concepts was to have wireless services, let's say in New York City, but then use the same spectrum in Albany for television. When you get near the edges in what we call adjacent markets, there is a ton of potential interference that can occur. And as a result, you have to create separation distances that are potentially hundreds of kilometers long or wide. And it's a very inefficient way to do it. So we support what is a down from 51, but to make sure that broadcasters are in their own chunk of spectrum and not having to share co-channel, at least, certainly in the adjacent markets. And I'll leave you with this, the future. Do not think of television as turning something on and sitting at home and watching Lawrence Welk that our parents did. We have, within 2 years, 2009 is when the digital transition took place. Within 2 years, they had developed mobile DTV technology. We are in the process now of developing a new digital standard that will be not only far more efficient, but far more flexible. And one of the problems that doesn't get talked a lot about is that for the last several years, we have been frozen in place, not knowing what our spectrum is going to do. And we need some certainty to create investment so that we can improve service. We're still the #1 shows in terms of news, entertainment, and content going out there, but we need to compete in this wireless world, and we hope we'll have the ability to do it after this is over. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We hand this down to Armand, and we'll get his slides up. Just for the record, my parents really didn't like Lawrence Welk at all. But.
You know that I obviously suffered as a teenager, that's for sure.
Okay, well, it's great to follow David and Charles. After hearing them, I realized why I was probably invited here, because I'm not quite sure which one of them I disagree with more. But hopefully that will turn this into a lively discussion. First, the little piece of lawyerly disclosure, which tells you not to pay too much attention to what I say. Just for my background, what I do primarily is valuation work related to the satellite media and telecom industry, and I've been spending a particularly large amount of time on spectrum valuation recently. There we go. And in fact, wrote 2 papers related to property rights and spectrum, which have something to do with valuation, and I'll get into that. And if anyone wants to dig into property rights, and particularly property rights for television broadcasters, those papers may be of interest. So this is essentially what I'm going to talk about, is the background of the process, the valuation challenges, the bull and the bear case, and some pricing information. As people have alluded to in the past, clearly demand for mobile data is rising dramatically, and you can find all kinds of charts, all kinds of surveys, all of which have this massive upward trend that looks kind of like that. That's probably no surprise to anybody. And so to deal with that, the FCC has clearly found itself a little bit short of spectrum. And in the past really 7 years, they've dramatically increased the amount of spectrum available from 170 megahertz to 608 megahertz. And that's actually a pretty impressive rate for a government agency to be working at. That means that the U.S. really has more spectrum available for mobile broadband than any other country that is able to find, except Germany, which has 615 megahertz, so just slightly higher. But still, we're looking for more. The FCC wants to add another 300 megahertz as part of the 2010 National Broadband Plan. And the biggest part of that was intended to come from the television broadcasters. And that's basically why we're here today. And that's probably the toughest of these to pull off, is that piece there, the 120 megahertz, or potentially a little bit less. Generally speaking, reallocating spectrum when the FCC tries it is a very long, laborious process that takes forever. And here's some of the time periods that it's taken in the past. And so this incentive auction process was set up to do things a little bit quicker, to allow the broadcasters, the license holders, to voluntarily relinquish their rights and therefore speed things up a little bit. Now, when you start to think about the television broadcast, it's a kind of an interesting situation. And that's because when you think about the FCC buying back spectrum, it's kind of awkward because the broadcasters, although they have licenses, they don't have property rights in those licenses. So really, the FCC, from a legal perspective, aside from the Jobs Act that was passed to authorize the incentive auction, doesn't really need to buy it back. They could just not renew the licenses. Of course, all hell would break loose in Congress when the lobbyists, like our buddies here, go after them. But in theory, they could do that. And that creates sort of an interesting dilemma is how much you're going to pay to get something back that you don't really need to pay for. And it creates a dynamic where the auction is not a strict economic situation. So it's not like going to the store to buy an apple at price for apples. You're going to buy an apple from the guy at the corner who's your brother-in-law who has a sick kid, but you really know that he got the apples from your tree the night before. And so, how much do you pay for that apple? There's just so much going on that really doesn't have anything to do with the market. And so that's kind of what we're at here a little bit. And in fact, the real reason the FCC is paying the broadcasters is that they want to re-auction the spectrum to the wireless providers. But if they take it away from the broadcasters without paying them, and then they say to the wireless providers, "Hey, we want to sell it to you," they're not going to quite pay as much because their rights have been sort of undermined. There's also the broadcasters do have a fair amount of political power, and of course the broadcasters can hold things up just through various due process issues. But they've created a whole series of practical considerations which have essentially, in effect, created property rights from a practical perspective. And so that's the situation for the broadcasters and trying to understand how much the FCC is going to want to pay them. It's just fraught with more political issues than really strict economic issues. On the other side, you have the wireless providers. And there you have a really unusual situation coming up at the same time, in that there's absolutely no consensus in terms of the future growth rates in terms of demand, nor is there much consensus in terms of supply. And I'll go into that a little bit more. On one hand, people say that smartphones are coming out everywhere, which use something like 19 times the amount of data, videos being used, M2M traffic is increasing dramatically. In fact, I was at a conference recently, M2M means machine to machine. So increasingly, there's small devices that are being put on machine to transmit data to different networks. And someone had an interesting comment, said that right now there are more wireless devices than there are people. So in other words, we've run out of people to sell to, so now the wireless companies are selling to machines. Here's some data from Cisco. Again, talking about, I think we mentioned this earlier, traffic going up by 70% year over year. One interesting point is that the top 1% of users use a disproportionate amount of traffic. In fact, that top 1% is down a little bit year over year. Smartphones, 4G has been a dramatic impact in terms of increase in usage. Tablets, of course, even more so. And so the bull case in terms of demand for spectrum says that these trends are all just implying that wireless usage is essentially going through the roof. The bear case essentially is the opposite, saying that the data caps have been quite effective. Unlimited data plans have essentially been phased out or are largely being phased out. Fortunately, I still have one. But most people have been losing those pretty rapidly. There's been a lot of wireless CapEx spending over the last several years, which essentially has been dividing the wireless sites and therefore allowing them to reuse capacity more and more. In fact, when you look at the spectrum out there below 2 gigahertz, about a third of it is unused. And when you're talking about at sort of 2.5 gigahertz, the VRS spectrum, maybe a third of it's been built out, give or take. So a lot of the spectrum that's licensed out there hasn't even been built out. I'll hear from our T-Mobile colleagues about that in a minute. So there is a case that suggests that the growth in data demand has actually slowed significantly. In fact, I saw a chart the other day from the FCC. I wasn't able to dig it up again, comparing traffic demand growths projections year over year. And the demand projections have actually come down. They haven't come down in absolute numbers, but the amount of increases started to come down. So there's a real debate about the rate of demand increase. In terms of supply, there's a similar debate going on. And one side of it says that not much more spectrum is going to be coming online. The FCC has already allocated the easy stuff. The incentive auction may never happen because it's going to be so hard to pull off, or if it happens, it'll be so far down the road and very few broadcasters will participate, and so they won't get anywhere near the 120 megahertz or the revised, 84 megahertz they're talking about now. The other side says, well, actually, a lot of the spectrum is coming online. Those processes are in place for the 300 megahertz. And additionally, there's a lot of unlicensed spectrum that's coming online. Unlicensed spectrum was alluded to earlier. So this would be spectrum that could be used without a license and shared. And an enormous amount of spectrum is being considered for unlicensed use, 1,474 megahertz. That compares to the 608 licensed megahertz that we have right now. Right now we also have about 550 megahertz of Wi-Fi spectrum. There are about somewhere between 440, and depending on how you read it, just under 500 megahertz of unlicensed spectrum in the NPRM stage. So that's reasonably far along. Just to give you an idea of how extreme the variations are, I was talking to two people at a conference recently who I respect very much, who spend their whole life working with license holders and working on different primarily on sales of licenses. And one said that television broadcasters are not going to participate in large numbers in the spectrum auction because they just won't get enough, and they're going to hold on to their spectrum because it's increasing at such a rapid rate. The other person, who I respect equally, said, well, actually what's going to happen is there's so much unlicensed spectrum coming on, we may not even need to have this incentive auction. Right. Okay. But in any case, the auction needs to raise probably about $9 billion, $8 to $9 billion, maybe even more, depending on how much the repacking costs, maybe $10 billion to hold it. So the spread needs to be between how much the government pays the broadcasters and how much they get on the other side. That spread needs to be at least that. And the Treasury is putting a lot of pressure on the FCC to increase that number more so that the extra goes to the Treasury. Because one of the big debates is how hard is the FCC going to push the broadcasters for a low price? Because I talked about the non-economic aspects of it. And there's, again, a lot of debates on that. On one hand, the government wants to get it done quickly and has an incentive to just give the broadcasters a fairly generous price as long as they can meet that sort of $9-10 billion, $8-10 billion spread. The other side says, well, hey, the Treasury's putting a lot of pressure on them, and what they'll do is they'll go to the broadcasters and say, you need to participate in this auction, you need to participate in a good price, because one way or another we're going to get your spectrum back, and if you don't participate in the auction and we have to get it back after it, that process is going to be a lot less pleasant for you. So, okay, so I guess the real answer is, what is the market saying? And I saw a very detailed analysis done by Scott Wallstein, who's, if you have a chance to read this paper, there's an incredible amount of detail in this. And he's analyzed essentially every spectrum auction and every spectrum sale that's been reported, and diced it by frequency and by all kinds of other factors in incredible detail. And what this is the actual average annual price increase in spectrum. And what it tells us, and so even when it goes down here, the price is still going up. It's just going up at a lower rate. So as long as it's not below zero, the price is still going up. You can see that around 2000, this area, when we had the iPhones coming out, everybody was worried that with all these smartphones coming out, there just wouldn't be enough spectrum out there. And the prices of spectrum went up by enormous amounts. And then it turns out the wireless companies were able to meet that demand. Everyone's smartphone's working. And the increase in prices have come down. And in fact, the last couple of years, prices have almost been flat. Another organization, Policy Tracker, did an analysis of about 200 auctions internationally of spectrum, and concluded in the last couple of years that globally, this is all U.S., but globally, actually, the price for spectrum has gone down at auctions. Governments have been essentially getting less revenue from auctions in the last couple of years than they had in prior years. And there's a couple of other dynamics that are playing into this. One is that when you move to 4G, we have now the more advanced service, or even 3G, larger amounts of spectrum are more efficient than smaller amounts of spectrum. So in other words, you got a 15 megahertz block that might be 5 or 6 times more efficient on a per megahertz basis than a 5 megahertz block. So now there's demand for much larger blocks. That's also encouraged a consolidation of the industry. So there's essentially fewer bidders because it makes no sense to get these small blocks. You want to get large blocks. And so generally speaking, there's less bidders. That's helped push some of the consolidation. I'm going to have to disagree with Charles that the U.S. has, from what I can, everything I've seen, everything I've looked at on a per minute or per megahertz basis has by far the lowest pricing anywhere in the world. U.S. consumers use their cell phones about 10 times the rate of other countries, and so their bill is a little higher. But the price per minute and price per megahertz is extremely low. And in fact, 70% of the 4G users in the world are right here in the United States. There's almost no 4G in Europe because the wireless carriers just don't want to invest in it. Okay, so that's just what I talked about. Some of these issues. And this final issue is that in some countries, the regulatory bodies and the FCC is grappling with this too because it makes more sense to have larger blocks of spectrum, are instituting policies with their spectrum auctions to limit the number of buyers, to make sure that the people who win get efficient size blocks of spectrum. And so there's a real trade-off between trying to have competition and trying to have spectrum blocks that are efficiently sized. Okay, there I am. Yeah, I hope I didn't. Is there anyone else I didn't offend yet? Okay. We'll wait till the discussion afterward.
Okay. And thanks, Armand. Now, Chris will give us the wireless industry perspective, at least the T-Mobile aspect of the wireless.
I did my best in my slides to keep it neutral. I don't want to get too much into advocacy, but I'll do my best to talk about it. Again, my name is Chris Wieczorek. I'm with T-Mobile. In the bio, I think it's just one thing I want to highlight, and I'm proud of it. I also happen to be an engineer, electrical engineer. I went to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, in addition to being an attorney. And I've been doing the spectrum work here for a couple of years now. I think when David was working on the various issues on the DTV transition, I was still in high school. But it was, I've been doing this for a little bit of a while now, and
I won't hold that against you, young man.
And it's been some really interesting things to do. My goal here today is to persuade folks here that the glass is half full, not half empty. That the process is working. It's working at a transparent process, more or less, and we think there's a lot of good opportunities. I can tell you, I work on a daily basis before the FCC and practice in various filings and the like, seeing the various issues that are going on, and we think there's a lot of progress and a lot of very helpful, good things that's going on. For the slide, I wanted to keep it a brief slide. I wanted to keep it down to 3, since I guess we only have 5 to 7 minutes each, right? I think the issues that are really going to be critical are what's the broadcaster participation? How many, where are they going to be located? I think David alluded to that. The physical location of broadcasters who participate in the auction are very important. And because of the way the broadcast allocation is structured, even if you got no participation from any New York City broadcasters, if you can get some in Hartford, and if you get some in New Jersey, you can get a lot of spectrum in New York City potentially. So that's actually a major issue, and we think that's going to be an issue as well. Wireless participation, carriers, how many are going to be there and what are they going to pay for? How do they evaluate? I think that's been brought up as well, and we can talk a little bit more about that later on in the day. The other idea is satisfying the statutory obligations. There's the statute, the Jobs Act, enacted, by my math, $9.3 billion of specific allocations. $7 billion for the FirstNet public safety homeland security broadband network, 1.75 for broadcaster relocation, and a couple, the way Congress works, a couple $100 million there, a couple $100 million there. If you're up here in New York and you haven't been down to DC, if you're not cynical, you need to be. So the fourth thing is also achieving public policy obligations. Deficit reduction is only one of several policy obligations. Actually, we can point out competition is very important. And I think we've heard that repeated over and over again. David's pointing out is broadcasters provide a competitive input to the cable operators. Charles was pointing out that there needs to be wireless competition among for multiple consumers to be able to gain access to. Armand pointed out that there should be little competition, so maximum profits. No, but competition is an overriding theme that you see here, and I think we all experience it firsthand. And it's in the statute. It's Section 309 of the enabling statute. One of the important criteria the government and Congress has said is that the widely dissemination of auctions and a competitive dissemination for their people to have opportunities. The broadcast incentive auctions are particularly unique because of the spectrum that's involved. This low-band spectrum, which I think we can talk about more, really is an opportunity to provide a competitive input for carriers who don't have it. T-Mobile being one of us. Sprint has very little of it, whereas the legacy Bell operating companies, Verizon, AT&T, have quite a bit of it. That provides a very strong competitive advantage for them. So. I wanted to focus a little bit on the band plan because I figured, since I'm the token engineer on here, and we keep hearing about that, it's kind of an important issue. The FCC has gone through a lot of these different band plans, and the band plans effectively says how is the spectrum going to be divvied up and sold and the like. It's zoning, and if you think of it in terms of real property. And the FCC proposed a band plan at the initial notice of proposed rulemaking. That wasn't very widely positively received by a lot of folks. A lot of initial commenters proposed this alternative idea. Most of them actually agreed this idea from going from channel 51 for the TV stations down the band. NAB suggested that. T-Mobile suggested that. Verizon, AT&T, the various equipment vendors. In fact, I think it's pretty uniform consensus. Recently, 2 weeks ago, on Chairman Janikowski's last day, the FCC put out public notice exploring two other band plan ideas based on some of the input that's been received, and it's always great to have. I think this actually a kudos for the FCC because of the fact that you have this transparent process. There's more ideas being discussed because, let's face it, this is a very technically challenging issue, and I think that's very important for there to be a wide dissemination of ideas and thoughts. I think all the parties are really trying to look at the pros and cons of these issues, and nothing is going to be perfect. There's always going to be some kind of negative aspect of things. But I think the important thing is to distinguish what are impediments to making it perfect and what are impossibilities for making it actually doable. And I think that there are plenty of impediments out there, but there are very few impossibilities. And we're trying to make things work in an economically feasible way and a technically feasible way. And I'm going to end my slide, and you can see just some of these different band plans. And 6 of the major, band plans I proffer that are being well and examined by the FCC. The original FCC had this idea, and again, it's deliberately meant small. There's no quizzing or testing on this at any time. You can see these different ideas and how some folks are kind of working on these different band plans and pairing and the like. The T-Mobile perspective, we have our band plan up there. Our idea is to maximize the amount of paired spectrum. We think that's really important to be able to provide competitive inputs and be able to have what's called an uplink and a downlink, which really is the ability to provide a diverse and wide amount of coverage and the like. So the incentive auctions is really this last opportunity to get a foothold or a toehold even in the low band spectrum area, which is, and for instance, in New York City, the way the spectrum's allocated in New York City, AT&T has spectrum, Verizon has spectrum in the low band, and that's it. I guess Sprint just recently got some, but they're only able to use a little bit of it, and it doesn't really provide a big oomph in terms of the amount of capacity that's out there. And so this incentive auction process theoretically could maybe make up to 120 megahertz of spectrum available. That's a lot of spectrum available. I could almost double the amount of existing low band spectrum, and so having an opportunity and access to that. Yeah, go ahead.
So what does down from 51 mean?
So down from 51 means channel 51 is a sorting frequency, 698 megahertz, if I recall correctly. Yep. And you take the frequencies and you work down from it. So you go from 698 to 697, 696, etc. The FCC's original band plan actually had some of the mobile operations here, TV stations in the middle, and more mobile operations down below it. And it kind of was a split. And so there are certain challenges and cons affected with that, and that's what they mean contrasting that thing, the difference between a down from 51 versus the FCC band plan. That shouldn't be confused with something what David alluded to here earlier called a variable band plan. Almost all of these band plans up here have some kind of variability component, and it will vary possibly geography. The amount of spectrum that's recovered in New York City probably isn't going to be the same amount of spectrum that's recovered in Topeka, Kansas, or in San Francisco. And having the flexibility to do that, we think is very important, and I think most of the wireless industry thinks it's important. I know David has probably has a slightly different perspective. Our concern is getting to the least common denominator approach, because that, it says the smallest amount of spectrum dictates how the entire country works out. And that's problematic because in reality, there may be parts of the country, especially along the border, where no spectrum is cleared because of Canadian border or some kind of impediments. And that's a failed auction, a failed process. So,
as I look at this, I see T-Mobile's proposal contrasts with the others that are, as we say, shoehorned, slice and dice, when you have this paired sort of like, large chunks kind of proposal. So is there economic as well as engineering efficiencies, the rationale for the T-Mobile proposal?
Yeah, I think there are some efficiencies. Actually, the Verizon and T-Mobile perspective are very similar, in fact, almost identical the same. It's just the color's a little bit different. I think I did a better job with the graphics on the T-Mobile proposal. But I mean, they're very similar. AT&T is a little complex, but they're a pretty good idea. So there are a wide variety of ideas. We think we think it's relatively simplistic, but large contiguous chunks of spectrum is very good. I know we've been independently praised for having a band plan that produces the largest amount of paired licensed spectrum available for folks.
And why is that? Why is that? Because of technical or economic reasons?
Yeah, well, because of technical issues, and we thought this was doable, and economic issues. We want to see a lot of spectrum out there because it provides a lot of more fish in a pond, and so everyone can win some way or another, and alleviates a lot of problems.
Chris, with everyone using their smartphone, there's so much more download traffic than there's upload traffic. Why do you want?
Why they?
Yeah, why? Yeah. I mean,
well, it's a good question.
How about this nice Verizon TDD approach there?
Well, that's Sprint TDD approach.
Sprint,
so TDD, if I can put that on a separate matter, but I think it's very important for folks to realize this spectrum, this low band spectrum, is really good for what's called coverage purposes as opposed to capacity purposes. And we see that today in Wi-Fi offloading. People use Wi-Fi offloading because the Wi-Fi is a relatively large chunk of spectrum that you can get a very large signals. This whole idea of broadband communication is actually a relatively novel thing. A lot of the Verizon 3G networks that you use, the CDMA uses only 1.25 megahertz of spectrum. AT&T and T-Mobile's 3G and 4G UMTS/HSPA Plus uses 3.84 megahertz of spectrum, so about a little bit bigger. Verizon and T-Mobile and AT&T's LTE networks now use about 10 megahertz of spectrum, and that's only within the last 18 to 24 months that this stuff has come about. So there's a little bit of novelty for the contiguousness of how the spectrum works out. If I can close on my points, I want one last thing. I think it's important to realize that this is an incentive auction. So there's Congress has expressed a preference to see participation in the auction. This is not the FCC is working to provide incentives. They're not looking to be a broker or a middleman and the like. It's like a smoking cessation program. You're looking to incentivize people to participate. I think that's really important. There's certain boundaries of what they can do, and as David points out, it really should be voluntary. And there's the right way to do it and hopefully the wrong way to do it. And we think the FCC is looking at the right way to do things. So with that, I'll turn back and try to keep myself within the 7 minutes I have.
Thanks.
Actually,
So,
if I could ask a question.
Sure.
When I hear voluntary and incentives, what comes to mind is in broadcast regulation at the FCC. We're not going to give you a forfeiture order. We're going to have you sign a consent decree and make a voluntary contribution to the U.S. Treasury. Is there going to be a sort of comparable pressure on broadcasters in terms of voluntariness?
We hope not. I think the question of voluntary, and up to now certainly Congress has said voluntary means exactly what it is, voluntary. But there are a number of ways you can go about it. The repacking, for those who do not want to participate, the repacking is not voluntary. That's required. And so then the question becomes, even if I don't want to participate in it, in the context of repacking, is my coverage area going to get reduced to the point where I begin to lose service area? Will we redefine the engineering aspects of broadcasting in the OET 69 proceeding where I begin to lose service area? So there may be, in its strictest sense, a voluntary participation in the auction. And that's why I mean it from the bottom of our heart. We want this auction to succeed. Because if the FCC makes an a priori decision that we want to take, and there are some who argue this, we want to take 120 megahertz of spectrum, then the next question is, okay, for those who are left, how do we make that fit? And that's really one of the issues that comes up here. At the same time, and I think we've talked about it a little bit, there's tremendous pressure brought to bear to have a successful auction, to fund not only deficit reduction, but certainly public safety equipment as well. So we want it to succeed. We're beginning to see some things that make us a little nervous, but I'm hopeful that we'll be able to work it out, and this will go forward as a voluntary approach.
Okay, question?
I have a couple of questions, actually.
Sure.
You guys didn't address the very small business spectrum at all in your discussion. It turns out that over the last 20 years, or X amount of time, there's spectrum allocated for very small businesses, very small wireless businesses to be able to be used, and that was with a 20 or 30, 25% discount. It turns out that over the last decade, about $20 billion has been given of the small business spectrum to the large corporations who ended up with the spectrum. It's known as designated entities. It also turns out that we filed multiple years ago because it turns out that about $8 billion was done before 2008. So a small business, a very small business, wins the spectrum deal. It's owned by a larger corporation, which is AT&T or Verizon. AT&T and Verizon basically get this spectrum not only for use, but then own the spectrum after a couple of years. This is common practice. You guys haven't brought it up at all about what happened to the spectrum. Number two, the FCC's data on this is atrocious. In the back of every docket, there is something called the Initial Regulatory Flexibility Act analysis, which is a small business impact study. It turns out that the data used by the FCC is from 1992 for the small business spectrum for 1992, and it doesn't bother to give you the history of what happened to the spectrum over those years, of which if you track it, which we did, it turns out that AT&T and Verizon had multiple times taken over the spectrum deal. The third thing that should scare everybody is that all of the wireless things are connected to the special access lines that AT&T and Verizon own. And so what you have now basically is two large corporations that have sweetheart deals with their incumbents so that T-Mobile pays at least double what Verizon is paying in the state of New York for the same exact access, of which it affects the entire spectrum analysis, because what happens is these guys not only have a sweetheart deal, but they have a competitive advantage across the United States. So they get $20 billion of extra spectrum. That's for the very small businesses. There's no discussion here of what's going to happen with the very small businesses. The very small businesses never had any recourse because they don't have the budget to go out and fight the large companies. And the special access deals that Verizon has, for example, in New York, where it's paying half of what AT&T and Sprint are paying, should be a concern to everybody, because if they win the spectrum, they get to monopolize these products. Any comments?
Yeah, I think we have to keep in mind is that this industry, whether you're talking about the wireless carriers or the broadcasters, it's a very regulatory intensive business. And I recently was looking up under and I don't remember the exact ranks, but certainly both AT&T and Verizon were in the top 20 companies who donated money for in terms of lobbying. And then the CTA was also, their industry organization was right there. The NAB was also in the top, roughly the top 20 as well. This is a very politically motivated industry. The other thing, in terms of just thinking about the broadcasters, is one of the reasons they have so much political clout is that every congressman wants to be on good terms with their local radio station so that they get coverage, because that's exempt from the oftentimes that can be exempt from the equal coverage requirements. And so it's a tough industry for a small business person who doesn't have the money to do the proper lobbying.
And when some of the licenses because they don't have the budget to go out.
Some of the exceptions are in the spectrum that's less valuable, particularly in the satellite area. sometimes you do see the FCC appear to be bending over backward to grant flexibility in terms of waivers, in terms of when build-outs need to be deadlines are hit. So you do see the FCC giving some flexibility there, but that's usually in areas where there's less competition.
Do you think that they're going to care about this in this new spectrum incentive plans? Are they going to actually deal with the small businesses, or are they just going to throw them under the bus?
I know they throw them under the bus, but I'm not sure that it's whose radar screen that's on the top
The
of.
question was asked in the NPRM whether they should adopt any special provisions for the so-called designated entities. I think it's fair to say that no one at the FCC is particularly proud of the way that the designated entity program turned out. And, in part, in my own personal opinion, this had something to do with the fact that they were trying to provide incentives for businesses that were small and had difficulty accessing capital to get into a business that was a very capital-intensive business, a very difficult thing to do to begin with. Right. And so the FCC used bidding credits and, for a period of time, installment payments to provide an advantage to those smaller entities in the auction. Didn't work out well. The FCC made some mistakes in how they
Did the FCC reclaim the $20 billion worth of spectrum and give it to somebody else? No. Claiming that it was only supposed to go to small businesses and didn't?
Well, I mean, if
there were
violations of the rules,
Right.
then yes, but, and that has not been shown.
I mean, it's not direct, but it's akin to it. Is one of the entryways into broadcasting has been the low-power television industry, which the FCC has pushed and fostered for over almost 15 years. The net result of this proceeding may very well be to squeeze out most of your low-power TV stations in the United States.
Yeah, they're not covering the repacking.
Because in terms of repacking, while the FCC could protect them, low-power TV and translators are not given protection under the statute. So when you're doing any sort of repacking, the mom-and-pop translators throughout the West, and also through upstate New York, as well as your low-power TV stations, may very well get squeezed here.
I want to just inject a source of controversy here. There is disagreement about whether the FCC has the authority to include low power and translators into the statute, because just because they're not included in the statute doesn't mean one way or the other whether there's instruction from Congress. I know very specific members of staffers who say low power and translators were specifically excluded from the statute, and so they weren't to be included. But that's just
I agree, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't be. I guess unless you're saying that the staffers believe that they are actually there is a mandate that they do get excluded.
Yeah, and actually that is a position that is being stated, I think.
If you really want to see a lot of lawyers argue,
you know what will be very interesting? It'll be very interesting when all of the Adirondack starts losing television service and Mountain Lakes Public TV can't get through. Then we may have a different discussion, certainly at least with the New York delegation.
But they're watching on their smartphones.
And they're paying, and that's that's a very, because that really, I think, goes to the crux of this, is that if you look at all of this, I mean, you want 600 megahertz spectrum, the low band, because of its propagation characteristics. Certainly if you're looking for efficiencies in cell division and more efficient, you'd go move higher up in the band to cover New York City and the whole East Coast corridor. But what the 600 megahertz band does is it gives you a terrific propagation characteristics, particularly when you want to start doing offloading. A one-to-many, the next level of LTE or what have you. Now, they can pick it up on their smartphones is exactly the point here. Right now, I can get Mountain Lakes television over the air with an antenna for free. I don't charge for that. All you have to do is go to Radio Shack, you buy yourself a $29 antenna, you buy yourself a DTV, which right now the prices are dirt cheap. I bought one for $250 the other day, and I can watch in Albany 14 channels for free with an antenna. Now, of course, if this goes through and a lot of the spectrum gets squeezed out and sure enough, it's purchased and you develop it for offloading and downloading, you're right. You may still be able to get it, but you'll be paying by the minute as opposed to getting it free.
It's not necessarily true. You have you're talking only about the mobile carriers in terms of their pricing plans. Some of us are trying to do fixed point broadband, and that would allow you to do whatever video you want over IP.
Right, but you can that's exactly right. You can do it in the
And a
TV
lot of
rights
these people
basis.
but these people are not starving for UHF TV right now. They're starving because they're disconnected from the internet. And they're stuck paying $300 a month when they go over their data caps on their mobile device because that's their only connection.
Right.
And so people are screaming for us to bring this to them.
Right. Fixed WISP.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But not mobile. And that's what this is. Question in the back?
Yeah, for David,
Oh,
what
sure.
does this do in terms of the non-commercial community? Given that it's the UHF, and the tradition, some of the traditionally
Right.
non-commercial spectrum that is probably the highest value.
I think it does a number of things, and it does literally vary in some instances from state to state. First, because translators are not protected, a number of public TV organizations in the various states may lose a significant amount of reach. If you look at what apps filed, the Association of Public Television Stations filed in this proceeding, they are very, very concerned about that, as am I. There are, I think, some public TV, and it really does vary from state to state, that have large state-owned networks may not participate or may not sell for a variety of rules within the state for state-owned systems, or university-owned stations. For the classic public television station, I think that one can look at it that there are some business opportunities if I have 2 or 3 public television stations in a market, and I certainly can participate and essentially get the revenue from one in order to keep the other, the parent public TV station going. By the same token, I know a lot of folks in the public TV industry that, they view they're very serious, and they view their mission as providing non-commercial service to the public over multiple television stations. The ability now to multicast over those stations provides a plethora of new and exciting services. So, I guess the real issue is, sitting here today, I can't tell you how many public TV entities will embrace this and start auctioning. I simply don't know. What I do know, though, is that depending on how the auctions go, we want to make sure that their coverage areas and the populations they serve aren't diminished as a result of a repacking policy that results in smaller coverage areas.
Do you know what New York City is thinking of doing?
I do not.
One of the issues we haven't brought up is that television stations also have the option of reducing their amount of spectrum. So right now the licenses are 6 megahertz. With digital transmission, you generally don't need 6 megahertz to broadcast a television channel. So a station could give up perhaps half of its spectrum or shared spectrum with another station.
You're right, but not quite.
Embrace the money.
You're right, but not quite. You'll always have a 6 megahertz channel. The technology is based on 6 megahertz. I'm able to put 19.34 megabits per second down that stream, and I can subdivide that stream. So channel sharing is, in fact, that's what it is. But you're not technically losing you're not cutting it down to 3 megahertz. Is what I'm saying.
Okay.
So,
you get this,
speaking of channel sharing, David, what are you hearing from your membership about the viability of that as an option, and the attractiveness of it, and the practical challenges of it?
I think that there are some people who are looking at it, but I have to tell you, it's not a whole lot. This has not received a whole lot of chatter. There are some technical issues with it. Unlike now, where I can multicast and do multiple channels, I am responsible for the transmitter and for the content that goes over those channels. That's it. What the channel sharing approach is more akin to almost a condo approach, where I'm in the same building, but I actually have different owners. And working out those relationships. In other words, if you're channel 20, I may own the first channel 20, but my channel 20.2 will be owned and be licensed to some other entity. But we will be sharing the same transmitter and the same tower and the same facilities. So working out those arrangements, I don't think we're quite there yet. I really do think what's incumbent upon the FCC, and I know they're working exceedingly hard on this, is essentially to develop, there's a lot of unknowns here. We do need to see the software for repacking to make sure that to see how it works. We do need the rules established to try to get a sense of how this is all going to work. Until all that sort of comes to fruition, and I think it will over this year, my folks are looking at it, but I don't think anyone's made any firm commitments yet.
I've got other questions, but we have one here.
I've always been confused by the wireless microphone issue, why they didn't just say, let's just sunset analog use of the spectrum and you've got to shift to a digital system which is much more interference tolerant. Why didn't they do that?
The wireless mic issue is a lot more complex than most people think. You have right now in the space a number of wireless microphones that aren't licensed, yet are part of very, very large entities. You have a lot of folks, both some in the music business, some on Broadway, that are using wireless microphones. Some are licensed, some are not. The broadcasters are using licensed wireless microphones as well. And I think eventually what the FCC is trying to do is, by taking that spectrum away, is certainly to drive the technology and to shift it out. But as of yet, they haven't required that you can no longer have an analog wireless mic and you have to go with digital. My biggest concern in this entire debate has been, right now, if I want to cover an event, let's say I want to cover at Yankee Stadium, or I want to cover an event, I have to type into a database to make sure that my wireless microphone will work during the event. I have to type into a database where I get essentially a kilometer or circumference area around Yankee Stadium. And what's supposed to happen is the unlicensed entities aren't supposed to invade that space. That's kind of the white space database that they're working out right now. My biggest concern is that we still use a lot of spectrum, or at least the two channels that they left us, that the FCC left us as a result of the white space proceeding, for all the wireless microphones, licensed wireless microphones in New York City to cover news and public affairs across the city. And all my engineers tell me that that's just not enough. It's just completely cramped.
Why don't they use the internet?
Well, you're doing short hops with a wireless mic, right? I'm not using long-term internet. We are using, in certain day-to-day situations, sort of from a remote back to the station. You do have some folks using bonded cellular, which allows you to use your cellular companies to get from the remote truck back to the studio. One of the things that we run into, unfortunately, during emergencies, when all of a sudden all that explodes and usage becomes really important, is you're still using your cellular infrastructure and it gets overloaded and tends to shut down. So we still cling to very much the use of what we call our broadcast auxiliary spectrum in the 2 gigahertz band, the BAS spectrum, because that is dedicated and it won't shut down or overload. Sorry, I didn't mean.
Chris, this question primarily for you. Do you think that it's necessary for the commission to resolve the band plan first before it tackles some of the other issues in the proceeding?
You know, I think it's not necessarily always going to be perfect before you get all the other proceedings done, but we think it is important to start working on, and what the FCC has done. The band plan is the first thing the FCC's worked on, so we do think it's very important. I don't think it's going to be perfectly resolved, but 90% of it should, ideally get done before most of the rest of the items are going to get done. But there are many things in the incentive auction process. Every one of these things is a little knob you have to change. You want to get the auction rules right. You want to get the reverse participation rules right. You want to get the forward participation rules right, and aggregation limits right. All these various things that can be adjusted concomitant with the band plan. I think those should be done as well. So.
The band plan has a huge impact on valuation and how that's set up depending upon the provider. And so the FCC, in terms of gauging how much interest there's going to be to buy it on the other side, which is going to affect how much they might want to pay the broadcasters, and how much how aggressively they're going to run the process, is really a lot of that will be determined by the band plan. And so that ends up being an important driver in the process.
If there's no consensus on valuation on either side, do you have a range you can give us? What's a TV broadcaster to get? Is that a stupid question?
Well, the market is going to decide it. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, the market.
Is it dollar per pop?
Well, it's usually you think of it dollars per megahertz pop, right? And the auction would be limited probably to the top 35 stations if you're talking 120 megahertz, the top 35 markets if you're talking 120 megahertz, less than that if you're talking a smaller amount. And in those markets, in terms of selling it to the wireless carriers, you're talking a price of probably north of $2 per megahertz pop, and in a city like New York, north of that, particularly for this prime spectrum. Now, in terms of how much they'd actually pay the broadcasters, a lot of these markets there's unused broadcasting spectrum, right?
No.
So some of those markets.
No, absolutely not. Not in the East Coast.
I'll go from Manchester.
From Manchester to Richmond. Most of that, just about every. Well, see, here's the problem that people don't understand.
In the spacing requirements.
I have, if you go, I'll use a VHF for an example. I have a Channel 5 in Boston. I don't have a Channel 5 in Hartford. I don't have a Channel 5 in Providence. Why? Because if I did, I'd interfere with Boston and Providence over the southern part of Massachusetts. I have a Channel 5 in New York. I don't have a Channel 5 in Philadelphia because if I had a Channel 5 in Philadelphia, all of northern New Jersey would revolt because you'd get complete interference over that entire area. You don't see another Channel 5 until Washington, D.C. That doesn't mean it's being unused. That means is that the way the system is based in terms of the coverage areas that are being provided, the engineering tells you you can't plop another station in there. So when people see a chart and says, oh my God, you've got all this space, you don't. And what the real point there is when I build a television set, I'm building a television set to lock onto a particular channel and reject all others. And that set works within a certain environment. And if you start with the squeezing in stations or short spacing, what you get essentially is mounds and mounds of interference. Perhaps the best example of what not to do, and no one listens to this, but if you ever turn on your AM band sometime in your set, in your car, and what you hear is a lot of static. And that was because everybody started shoehorning in AM stations all over the place. And essentially, it becomes a law of externalities, and it just pollutes the band.
The FCC is assuming that there's roughly 35 markets in the country where there's not 120 megahertz free. So there's only 35 markets where there's not at least 20 free stations in the country. That's their analysis.
Well, one of the problems I hear you. But one of the problems I'll tell you one of the problems with the FCC analysis. When the FCC broadband task force, when the broadband task force first said they could get 120 megahertz of spectrum and could get this nationwide, they forgot to include all the spectrum agreements with Canada.
Yeah.
Okay? When they reported something later and said, aha, once you include all this, assuming no one participates in the auction, if they wanted to get a nationwide block, that number went down about 6, if memory serves me right. Now, you may be able to get spectrum in Montana. You may be able to get spectrum in the middle of Kansas. But on the East Coast, which is where everybody wants it, you have a spectrum crunch. And that crunch starts in just a bit north of Manchester, New Hampshire, and goes a little bit south of Richmond. That's just the engineering. It's not markets, it's engineering.
Okay, let me get back to this question. So, part of the... how much? Okay. So, the FCC thinks there's 35 channels, and most people I speak to think that's the right range. And obviously, we have disagreement here. So maybe it's more. And one of the issues is clearly that there are interlocking issues, as has been brought up. Right. And that will come down to a lot to how the FCC runs the auction. And there's been a couple proposals as to whether it will be a blind auction where people put out their price and the FCC decides to accept or reject it. The other process that, I'm blanking on her name, Rebecca Hansen from the FCC recently indicated at a talk similar to this, was that they'd be doing a process where they're going to grade each station and essentially give them a price to accept or reject. And so that would have potentially a very different price. There's another process that they may do whereby every station puts in their bid to give up their spectrum. The FCC looks at it, and let's say in one market they want to take 5 of them. Everyone will get the fifth, whatever the fifth highest one is, or whatever it takes to clear, everyone will get that same price. So there's a number of different mechanisms that may be used. And then you have certain stations that are between major markets, maybe between New York and Boston, which are going to be affecting multiple markets, and the FCC has to decide, do they want to pay a real premium because they really have to get that out of there.
Yeah, and if I
think that's right.
If I want to point something
we
out,
agree on something.
Yeah.
No, well, that proves my point, because you can't, if you want to help clear New York, because of the way the allocations are set up, you really should start looking at Hartford.
Right.
You really should start looking at Albany. You should start looking at, believe it or not only Philadelphia, but Wilkes-Barre. Because of the way the interference patterns, those smaller markets that are adjacent to large markets, for clearing purposes, that spectrum could be very valuable.
And for our friends here who are law students, I want to see if I can pull off the old try to get a word or phrase into a discussion, and when you're talking instant messenger or Facebook. He's using an office analogy, looking at the table of allocations and the big concerns. Believe it or not, one of the biggest TV markets that can have a big impact upon this daisy chain effect is Scranton.
Yes.
And so you could have a situation where nobody participates in New York City, but if you get the Scranton TV stations, you could potentially give them a lot of money to relocate and get sent to where, I forgot the other place they got relocated when they downsized the office, but Touche. And so there's that premise here, and I think that's what I think maybe what pointing out that with David is that just the East Coast is completely booked up, but if you pull that one little peg out, suddenly a whole bunch of dominoes fall out, and a lot of spectrum comes out, and that's the central premise that. Simply, if they have to throw a lot of money to get one or two TV stations in New York City to participate, which I think is a real possibility, you could suddenly get a lot of spectrum that shakes out of the whole East Coast daisy chain effect.
So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to identify an issue or two that you think is important to this whole FCC proceeding but hasn't gotten the attention that it deserved. You mentioned wireless mics earlier, but why don't we start, Armand, can you think of anything that you think will become more prominent but hasn't yet received enough attention?
I think the issue that's getting more and more attention is spectrum sharing. And what, if any, of this spectrum, to what extent we're going to have pieces in here that are guard band spectrum or pieces of the duplex gap that are allocated for shared use. That has become an incredibly hot topic. In fact, let me show you something. I recently finished a book on spectrum. If anyone wants a copy, send me an email. And I sent around drafts of this to different people in the industry. Everyone got back to me and said, virtually every comment was, include more information about shared spectrum. That the idea that spectrum can be shared without licenses and you can potentially dramatically increase the usage. In fact, there was a study done a couple of years ago suggesting that even in large cities like New York, Chicago, most of the spectrum is used less than 20% of the time. And most of the spectrum less than 20% of the spectrum is used in any given day. So there's an incredible underutilization of spectrum that could be ameliorated by sharing it. And you may see more pressure to increase some of these guard bands, some of these duplex gaps for allocation for shared spectrum.
I think the two issues I'll highlight is ensuring that there's broadcaster participation and done in a voluntary way. I think, as is pointed out, getting the broadcasters to participate in the auction, I think, is really important, and how the FCC goes about doing that and ensuring it maintains the statutory obligation, making it voluntary. Whether it's a very specific targeted outreach or putting out certain monetary amounts and making it sure it gets clear into the board of directors and the leadership organizations of these various television stations. I think that's really important. And I think it's just the nature of television broadcasting and what it's going to look like in 18 to 24 months when these incentive auctions take place. Because keep in mind, we're thinking of today's frame of reference. We're looking at 2 years down the line when these auctions will take place, and there may be different business considerations for the broadcasting community, 2 years down the line. For all I know, mobile TV and the new technologies may take off, and every handset, iPad, and iPhone will have a mobile TV digital receiver in it. Alternatively, that may not take off, and there may be a declining interest in broadcast television, and there may be a lot more people interested in deciding to go to web-only and app-based TV watching, and there may be a larger amount of participation. I don't know, and I won't speculate, but I think those are the two big issues.
Chuck?
I'm not sure I have anything. I mean, I just feel that innovation is a big unknown, and we've seen so much innovation over just the last couple of years, and so some.
Aereo, anyone?
Yeah.
You had to say it, didn't you?
I just said the word.
Yeah, but by the way, Aereo, if people haven't heard about it, it's a system where you can get your local stations on the internet for, I think, $9 or something like that. And it's actually may have a huge impact on the spectrum
There may be a
auction.
lot of people watching broadcasts over Aereo than maybe other.
Right,
Yeah.
because and some of the broadcasters are so upset about this that they've actually threatened to go off the air.
Yeah, Fox.
Yeah.
As if there'd be no impact on the
Fox and
audience,
NBC,
the
right?
affiliates,
I mean, 90% of their audience is through cable and satellite, and if Aereo's taking it for free and undermining their market, it actually makes sense for them to go off the air. It makes sense for them to give back their spectrum. That changes the whole dynamics of the spectrum auction. Should that happen, I think it's a long shot, but should that happen, that would dramatically change the dynamics.
I think David.
Imagine if every Fox affiliate and every went off the air.
Let's look.
Actually, let me put in another plug for the entertainment section of New York State Bar. We're doing a thing with CMJ, College Music Program. We have Michael Elkin from Winston, who's involved with the Aereo litigation. As you guys may or may not know, there's a circuit split.
Right,
coming up
exactly.
between 2nd and 9th, and
It's a New York Association of Broadcasters. Are you guys interveners in that case?
No.
Or? Okay.
No.
Sure.
Let me give David a chance to answer.
I got just two things, but let me start with Aereo. Do all of you know what Aereo is at this point in the room? I mean, I think the question is obviously you have litigation that's based on copyright law, and you do have a split in the circuits, and whether or not someone as a business, after creating, this quote unquote technology or gimmick to create thousands of little antennas and say, aha, this is yours, it's a private use, therefore it doesn't trigger the Copyright Act. Whether that is sustained ultimately by the courts, given that you do have a split, I think it is a long shot in the part of Aereo. So I don't believe Aereo is going to kill the auctions, is what it comes down to. I also don't think it's going to kill the television business model, because I'm not so sure how long it will be around, given essentially, in our opinion, it's flagrant violation of the copyright law. But we will leave that to scores of lawyers who are probably more, who enjoy litigating that. But it makes a marvelous story, but in the long term for financial aspects, I just don't see it lasting all that long.
there's an analogy to using the channel 6 low end for FM.
Right.
Right.
But
Right.
right. Yeah, I think there are two other hidden issues, and I don't know how. The first, I think, will become more prevalent. It's been discussed, and that is what role, if any, will the international agreements with Canada take place? Right now, the FCC has said that they're working with Canada through the traditional liaison committee. The bottom line is that may not be enough, and it may require greater work at the international level, and we'll see how that goes. I think that may become much more prominent an issue going forward. The second sort of hidden issue here, and it's a difficult one, is that the broadcast industry is in the middle of, once again, changing its transmission system to ATSC 3. Whatever. Now, whenever you change a transmission system, you actually change the dynamics of how of coverage and what you can do with that system. Now, the industry would hope and ask that maybe we ought to wait to do the auction repack until you got the new ATSC system. The commissioner said, no, we're not going to wait. But what you see happening in the television industry in the last couple of years, despite the fact that our spectrum use has been incredibly uncertain, is a continuation of development of new transmission and technical systems, which will provide more ways to meet consumers and hit platforms. If this auction gets delayed out at the same time this new technology is being developed, you may see some changes as to how this approach. But that's a long shot down the road, but it's something to keep in mind because the transmission system is in the process of being changed. They're working on it.
Well, I got the signal that our time for the panel is up. Please join me in thanking all of our panelists. If everybody can stay around for a little while, we can continue more informally.